Sometimes the most meaningful friendships come from unexpected places. When a man's heart is big enough to see past what others have thrown away, he might discover something precious. In the harsh 1800s frontier, cowboy Eli Turner watched his neighbor abandon a weak donkey at his gate to die. Most men would have looked the other way, but Eli wasn't most men. He took in the creature, nursed it back to health, and gave it a name: Dusty. What started as simple kindness became something deeper. Through cattle drives, dangerous trails, and lonely nights under stars, Dusty proved more than another animal. But could this unlikely partnership survive the ultimate test that the frontier had in store for them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Texas sun had not yet painted the horizon when Eli Turner stepped onto his front porch, coffee cup in hand, surveying the land that had become both his sanctuary and his prison. At 45, his face bore the deep lines that only years of squinting against prairie wind and desert sun could carve. His hands, wrapped around the warm ceramic, told stories of countless mornings just like this one. Calloused from rope work, scarred from mending fence, steady despite the loneliness that had settled into his bones like winter cold, the Turner ranch stretched across 500 acres of stubborn Texas soil, where mesquite trees dotted rolling hills and creek beds ran dry more often than not. It wasn't much by some standards, but it was his, bought with money earned driving cattle from San Antonio to Kansas, one grueling mile at a time. The modest wooden house behind him creaked in the morning breeze, its weathered boards grey from years of sun and storm. Sarah had painted those boards white once, back when hope lived in every corner of their home. 3 years had passed since the fever took her. 3 years since he'd buried his wife beneath the old oak tree on the hill, where she could look down on the wildflowers she'd loved so much. The house still held traces of her presence, the blue curtains she'd sewn, the herb garden now gone to weeds, the rocking chair on the porch where she used to sit and watch him work. Some evenings, when the wind was just right, he could almost hear her humming the old hymns she favored. Eli walked to the barn, his boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. Inside, his horse ranger nickered a greeting, and the old milk cow, Bessie, shifted in her stall. His daily routine had become ritual: feed the animals, check the water troughs, mend whatever the night had broken. Work was his salvation, the thing that kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too far into the darkness that grief could bring. From the barn doorway, he could see smoke rising from Jake Morrison's chimney across the valley. The Morrison spread was larger than Eli's. More profitable too, though Jake had inherited most of his land, while Eli had earned every acre. Jake was a hard man who measured everything in dollars and cents, including the worth of animals. He worked his horses until they were broken, sold his cattle the moment they brought top dollar, and had no patience for anything that didn't turn a profit. The two men had been neighbors for over a decade, but they'd never been friends. Jake saw Eli's kindness toward animals as weakness, the way he'd spend extra money on veterinary care or keep an old horse past its useful years. Soft-hearted fool. Jake had called him more than once, though never quite loud enough to start a real fight. Eli retrieved his father's worn leather journal from its place on the workbench, its pages yellowed with age and use. Samuel Turner had been a different kind of cattleman, one who believed that treating animals with respect brought better results than breaking them with force. The journal contained decades of wisdom about animal husbandry, weather patterns, and the subtle arts of reading livestock behavior. More than that, it held life lessons written in his father's careful hand. A man's character shows clearest in how he treats creatures that can't fight back, read one entry dated 20 years before Eli's birth. Kindness ain't weakness, it's strength-controlled. Another passage, marked with a coffee stain from years of reference, stated simply, animals know a man's heart before he speaks a word. They can smell fear, sense anger, and feel love. Treat them honest, and they'll give you their best. Eli had tried to live by those principles, even when it cost him money or earned him mockery from harder men. His horses worked willingly because they trusted him. His cattle moved easily because they weren't afraid of him. Other ranchers might get faster results with whip and spur, but Eli's animals lived longer, worked better, and somehow seemed to understand that they were partners in the enterprise rather than just tools to be used. The morning sun climbed higher as Eli went about his chores, feeding grain to the horses and checking the fence line where the creek ran between his property and Jake Morrison's. The barbed wire was solid, but he noticed fresh hoof prints in the mud, unshod prints that didn't belong to any of his animals. He was pondering this when he heard voices carrying across the valley wind. Jake Morrison's voice, rough and impatient, mixed with another man's protests. Eli couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear enough. Someone was getting a tongue lashing, and from the sound of it, that someone was trying to explain something Jake didn't want to hear. Eli had learned long ago that Jake's business was Jake's business, but something in the quality of the sound made him uneasy. There was desperation in that second voice, the kind that came when a man was backed into a corner, with no good choices left. By midday, the voices had stopped, replaced by the normal sounds of ranch work, cattle lowing, horses moving in the corral, the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood. Eli was repairing a gate hinge when he noticed the dust cloud rising from the Morrison place. A wagon was moving away from the ranch house, heading toward the main road that led to town. That evening, as Eli sat on his porch watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, he opened his father's journal again. The entries weren't just about cattle and horses. They were about life, lived with purpose, about finding meaning in simple work, about the responsibility that came with owning land and caring for the creatures on it. One passage, written during a particularly hard winter, caught his attention. Hardship has a way of showing what a man's truly made of. Some grow bitter, some grow selfish, and some grow wise. The wise ones understand that strength shared multiplies, while strength hoarded diminishes. Eli closed the journal and looked out across his land, where his cattle grazed peacefully in the gathering dusk. Tomorrow would bring the same routine: feed, water, mend, tend. It was a good life, even if it was a lonely one. He had his health, his land, and the satisfaction that came from honest work honestly done. But as he sat there in the growing darkness, listening to the night sounds of the frontier, coyotes calling in the distance, wind rustling through the mesquite, the creak of the old windmill, Eli Turner had no way of knowing that tomorrow would bring a choice that would change everything. Sometimes a man's character is tested not by the big decisions, but by the small ones. The choice to help or ignore, to show mercy or turn away, to see value where others see worthlessness. Tomorrow would bring such a test, and it would come with forelegs, long ears, and eyes that had known too much hardship already. Dawn was breaking grey and cold when Eli stepped out to begin his morning routine, but something was wrong. Where the gate to his corral should have stood open and welcoming, a dark shape huddled against the wooden posts. As he approached, the shape resolved into something that made his stomach tighten with anger and sadness. A donkey, small and pathetically thin, lay pressed against the fence. Its ribs showed through matted brown and grey fur, and its breathing came in shallow, laboured gasps. The animal's head lifted weakly at Eli's footsteps, revealing eyes that held the dull resignation of a creature that had given up hope. But it was the brand mark on the donkey's hip that truly told the story. Someone had burned a crude M into its hide, not with the careful precision of a proper branding iron, but with something makeshift and brutal. The mark was infected, surrounded by swollen flesh that spoke of recent pain and neglect. "Jesus," Eli whispered, kneeling beside the animal. The donkey didn't try to move away, too weak or too defeated to care about human approach. Eli ran gentle hands over its frame, feeling the sharp edges of bones beneath loose skin, the tremor of exhaustion in muscles pushed beyond endurance. A rope halter hung around the donkey's neck, frayed and weathered, its ends still showing where it had been cut. Someone had brought this animal here and abandoned it, cutting it loose like unwanted baggage and leaving it to die. "You poor creature," Eli murmured, his hands already moving to slip the halter free. "What has someone done to you?" The sound of approaching hoofbeats made him look up. Jake Morrison rode toward the fence line, his face set in its usual hard expression. He reined in his horse and looked down at Eli and the donkey with obvious displeasure. "I see you found my problem," Jake said without preamble. "Figured it would. Find its way to your place. Always do, the worthless ones." Eli stood slowly, his jaw tight. "This is yours? Was mine? Bought it off a man passing through, thought it might be useful for pack work. Turned out to be nothing but a burden. Eats more than it's worth, won't pull a decent load, and that infection's gonna cost more to treat than the animal's value. So you just dumped it at my gate to die?" Jake shrugged, seemingly unbothered by the accusation. "Didn't dump it. Turned. It loose. What it does after that ain't my concern. Maybe the coyotes will get it, maybe it'll wander off and die quiet somewhere. Either way, it's not eating my hay anymore." The casual cruelty of it hit Eli like a physical blow. He'd known Jake was hard, but this was something else entirely. This was a man who could look at suffering and feel nothing but inconvenience. "I'll take it," Eli said quietly. "Take what?" "The donkey. I'll take care of it." Jake laughed, a sound without humor. "Turner, you never cease to amaze me. That animal's half dead already. Even if you save it, what's the point? Can't work, cattle can't. Pull a plow worth a damn, can't even carry much of a load. It's just gonna eat your feed and give you nothing back." "Maybe," Eli said, returning his attention to the donkey. "But that's my choice to make. Your funeral." Jake turned his horse away, then looked back. "Don't come crying to me when you realize you've thrown good money after bad." As Jake rode away, Eli knelt beside the donkey again. The animal's eyes tracked his movement, and for the first time, Eli saw something other than resignation there. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the faintest spark of curiosity. "Well, friend," Eli said softly, "looks like you're my problem now. Question is, are you willing to fight for your life, or have you given up completely?" Getting the donkey to its feet took patience and gentle coaxing. The animal's legs trembled with weakness, but it managed to stand, swaying slightly. Eli fashioned a makeshift lead from a length of soft rope and began the slow journey to his barn, stopping frequently to let the donkey rest. In the barn, he prepared a stall with fresh straw and filled a bucket with clean water. The donkey drank greedily at first, then more carefully, as if afraid the water might disappear. Eli mixed oats with molasses, creating a mash that would be easier for the weakened animal to digest. As the donkey ate, Eli examined the infected brand more closely. The M had been burned deep, probably with a poker or piece of iron heated in a fire. The surrounding tissue was hot and swollen, clearly painful. It would need cleaning and treatment, but that could wait until the animal was stronger. "You need a name," Eli said, settling onto a feed bucket to watch his patient eat. "Can't just call you Donkey or It if you're going to be staying here." The animal's coat was a mixture of brown and grey, dusty from travel and neglect. When it lifted its head to look at him, dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight streaming through the barn door. "Dusty," Eli said, and the donkey's ears pricked forward at the sound. "That work for you, Dusty?" Something in the way the animal's ears moved, the slight tilt of its head, suggested approval. Or maybe Eli was just imagining it, seeing what he wanted to see in a creature too tired to react much to anything. Over the following days, Eli established a routine of care that revolved around his new charge. Every morning, he brought fresh water and feed, talking quietly while Dusty ate. The donkey's appetite improved steadily, and with it, a subtle change began to occur. The dull resignation in its eyes gave way to alert interest. Its head came up when Eli entered the barn, ears forward with what looked like recognition. The infected brand required daily cleaning with warm salt water. Dusty stood patiently for these treatments, as if understanding that the pain was necessary for healing. Slowly the swelling went down, the heat dissipated, and healthy tissue began to form over the cruel mark. By the end of the first week, Dusty was strong enough to venture into the corral for short periods. The donkey moved carefully at first, as if testing whether this good fortune was real or just another temporary kindness before abandonment. But Eli was always there, bringing food and water, checking the healing wound, speaking in the same calm, reassuring voice. It was during one of these corral visits that Eli first heard Dusty bray. The sound started low and uncertain, as if the donkey wasn't sure it remembered how to make noise. But as Eli approached with the evening feed, Dusty lifted its head and let out a long musical call that seemed to say both hello and thank you. "Well now," Eli said, grinning despite himself, "sounds like you're feeling better." The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Where there had been a broken, defeated animal left to die, there was now a creature with bright, intelligent eyes and a growing sense of confidence. Dusty began to follow Eli around the corral, not begging for food, but simply seeming to enjoy the companionship. One evening, as Eli sat on a fence rail watching Dusty graze in the corral, he reflected on the past week. He'd spent more on veterinary, supplies and good feed than many men made in a month, all for an animal that Jake Morrison had written off as worthless. By any practical measure, it was foolish. The donkey would never be a good cattle horse, would never pull a heavy load, would never earn back the money invested in its care. But as Dusty looked up from grazing and walked over to stand beside the fence, close enough that Eli could reach out and scratch behind its ears, he realized that worth wasn't always measured in dollars. Sometimes it was measured in the simple satisfaction of seeing life return to eyes that had held only despair. "You know what, Dusty?" Eli said quietly, continuing to scratch the donkey's ears. "I think you and I are going to get along just fine." 2 weeks into Dusty's recovery, Eli was beginning to understand that he'd underestimated his new companion. The donkey possessed an intelligence that showed itself in small ways. The careful attention it paid when Eli worked around the barn, the way it learned to untie simple knots with its teeth, the uncanny ability to sense Eli's mood and respond accordingly. It started with simple things. When Eli carried tools to repair a section of fence, Dusty would follow, then stand quietly holding the hammer or pliers in its mouth while Eli wrestled with wire and posts. The donkey seemed to understand that certain tasks required stillness, and others needed movement, adapting its behavior without being asked. "You're smarter than half the cowboys I've known," Eli told Dusty one morning, as the donkey carefully held a coil of rope while Eli mended a gate latch. "And more reliable than most of them, too." The bond growing between them reminded Eli of something Sarah used to say about animals. She'd had a gift with creatures, could gentle a skittish horse or coax a frightened cat out from under the porch with nothing but patience and soft words. "Animals know things we've forgotten," she'd told him once. "They remember that kindness is its own reward." He found Sarah's blue ribbon one evening, while looking for spare leather in their old trunk. The ribbon was faded now, but he remembered the day she'd won it at the county fair for her apple pie. She'd been so proud, not of the winning, but of the recognition that her work brought joy to others. She'd kept the ribbon as a reminder that small acts of care could have lasting value. Looking at the ribbon now, holding its soft fabric between work-roughened fingers, Eli could almost hear Sarah's laughter when she would have first seen Dusty. "Oh, Eli," she would have said, "look at those eyes. This one's got stories to tell." She would have loved the donkey's gentle nature, the way it nuzzled softly instead of demanding, the patience it showed when Eli was teaching it new things. Sarah had always believed that healing came through understanding, whether with animals or people. Teaching Dusty basic commands proved easier than Eli had expected. The donkey learned to come when called, to stand still for grooming, to back up on command. But more than that, it seemed to anticipate what Eli needed, often moving to help before being asked. When Eli worked on the windmill pump one afternoon, struggling to hold a heavy piece in place while tightening bolts, Dusty stepped forward and pressed its shoulder against the assembly, providing just enough support to make the job manageable. The donkey held the position without fidgeting, as if understanding that its help was genuinely needed. Not everyone saw value in what Eli was doing. When Tom Bradley, from the neighboring spread to the east, stopped by to discuss water rights, He couldn't hide his amusement at seeing Dusty following Eli around like a well-trained dog. "Here you took in Jake Morrison's reject," Tom said, nodding toward Dusty. "What you planning to do with it? Can't work cattle, can't pull much of a load. Seems like expensive kindness to me." "Maybe," Eli replied, scratching behind Dusty's ears. "But expensive kindness is still kindness. Sometimes that's enough." Tom shook his head. "You always were too soft-hearted for your own good, Turner. That animal's gonna eat more than it's worth." After Tom left, Eli found himself studying Dusty with new eyes, wondering if his neighbors were right. Was he being foolish, spending money and time on an animal that would never earn its keep? But as he watched Dusty move around the corral with growing confidence, its coat beginning to shine with proper nutrition and care, he realized he didn't care what others thought. The next test came when Eli decided to move a small group of cattle from the upper pasture to graze closer to the house. Normally this was a job for a horse, but Ranger was favoring his left front hoof, and Eli didn't want to risk making the injury worse. "Well, Dusty," he said, fashioning a simple hackamore from soft rope, "want to try some real ranch work?" The donkey stood calmly as Eli adjusted the makeshift bridle, showing none of the resistance he might have expected from an animal that had been mistreated. When Eli swung his leg over Dusty's back, the donkey turned its head to look at him with what seemed like curiosity rather than fear. The cattle were grazing peacefully in a small meadow bordered by creek willows. Eli wasn't sure how Dusty would react to the larger animals, but the donkey approached them with calm confidence. When a young bull lifted its head and snorted a challenge, Dusty simply stood its ground and waited. Moving the cattle proved easier than Eli had expected. Dusty seemed to understand the job instinctively, positioning itself correctly to guide the herd while never pushing too hard or moving too fast. The donkey's calm presence actually seemed to settle the cattle, making them easier to manage than they often were with a horse. By the time they had the cattle settled in the lower pasture, Eli was grinning with pride. Dusty had not only proven useful, but had shown a natural aptitude for the work. The donkey moved with purpose and intelligence, reading the cattle's behavior and responding appropriately. "Sarah would have loved this," Eli said aloud, patting Dusty's neck as they headed back to the barn. "She always said the best partnerships were built on understanding, not force." That evening, as Eli groomed Dusty in the barn, he found himself talking to the donkey in a way he hadn't talked to anyone since Sarah's death. About the challenges of ranch life, about the loneliness of working alone, about the small satisfactions that made the hard days worthwhile. Dusty listened with ears pricked forward, occasionally nuzzling Eli's shoulder or making soft sounds that seemed almost like conversation. There was something healing in having a companion again, even one who couldn't answer back with words. As the days passed, their routine evolved naturally. Dusty learned to carry tools in specially made panniers, to stand guard while Eli worked on equipment, to alert him when something unusual was happening around the ranch. The donkey's keen senses often picked up things Eli missed: the approach of visitors, changes in weather, or problems with the other animals. What surprised Eli most was how Dusty's presence began to fill the silence that had surrounded him since Sarah's death, not with noise, but with companionship, with the simple presence of another living being who seemed genuinely glad to see him each morning, made the daily routines feel less like burdens and more like shared purpose. One afternoon, while watching Dusty help move feed sacks by carrying the smaller ones in its teeth, Eli realized something had changed in himself as well. For the first time in 3 years, he was looking forward to tomorrow instead of just enduring today. The faded blue ribbon was tucked safely in his shirt pocket, a reminder that small acts of care could indeed have lasting value. Sarah had been right about many things, but perhaps most right about this. Sometimes the most important rewards weren't the ones you could measure in dollars and cents. The morning Eli discovered Dusty had independently gathered the scattered cattle was the morning he truly understood what kind of partner had wandered into his life. He'd awakened to find his small herd neatly grouped in the home pasture, when the night before they'd been spread across the upper meadow. Dusty stood among them like a proud shepherd, ears alert, and eyes bright with what looked remarkably like satisfaction. "How did you know to do that?" Eli asked, scratching the donkey's favorite spot behind its left ear. Dusty leaned into the touch, making soft sounds that Eli had come to recognize as contentment. Word of Dusty's unusual abilities began to spread among the ranching community, though reactions varied. Some, like Tom Bradley, remained skeptical. Others, particularly the older ranchers who'd seen enough unusual partnerships to keep open minds, showed cautious interest. Pete Hawkins, whose spread adjoined Eli's to the north, stopped by one afternoon specifically to see the donkey everyone was talking about. "Heard you got that Morrison reject doing actual work," Pete said, settling his considerable bulk on Eli's porch rail. "Tom Bradley says you're wasting time and money, but Tom's always been quick to judge." Eli called Dusty over, and the donkey approached with calm confidence, allowing Pete to examine its condition and bearing. What Pete saw was a well-fed, alert animal with intelligent eyes and a willing disposition, a far cry from the half-dead creature Jake Morrison had abandoned. "I'll be damned," Pete said, running expert hands over Dusty's frame. "This animal's in fine condition. Good muscle tone, bright eyes, calm temperament. How long you been working with it?" "About a month now," Eli replied. "Mostly just letting it find its own way to be useful." Smart approach. Force never did work with the intelligent ones. Pete straightened, nodding approvingly. "Mind if I see how it handles cattle?" The demonstration that followed surprised even Eli. Dusty worked the small group of cattle with remarkable intuition, never pushing too hard, but always applying pressure, in exactly the right place to guide the herd where they needed to go. The donkey seemed to read the cattle's mood and intentions, anticipating their movements and responding accordingly. "That's some of the finest stockwork I've seen from any animal," Pete admitted grudgingly, "horse or otherwise. You might have something special here, Turner." The validation from an experienced rancher meant more to Eli than he'd expected. He'd grown fond of Dusty for personal reasons, but knowing the donkey was genuinely useful, not just a burden carried out of misguided kindness, filled him with quiet pride. That evening, as Eli worked in his shop by lamplight, he found himself carving. His hands moved almost without conscious direction, shaping a piece of oak into something that had been forming in his mind for days. When he finished, he held a small feeding bucket, perfectly sized for Dusty and carved with simple but elegant lines. The bucket represented something more than mere function. It was a statement of commitment, a promise that Dusty's place on the ranch was permanent, no more makeshift arrangements or borrowed equipment. This bucket would be Dusty's own, marked with the donkey's name carved carefully into the smooth wood. When Eli presented the bucket the next morning, Dusty examined it carefully, sniffing the fresh wood and testing its weight by lifting it gently in strong teeth. The donkey seemed to understand the significance of the gift, standing still while Eli ran his hands over the carved letters. "There," Eli said quietly. "Now you're officially part of the Turner Ranch." A few days later, an unexpected visitor arrived, in the form of Father Miguel Santos, a traveling preacher who served the scattered communities along the frontier. Father Santos was a small, weathered man with kind eyes and hands that spoke of hard work despite his religious calling. "I heard in town about your unusual partnership," Father Santos said, accepting the cup of coffee Eli offered. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, does he not?" As they talked, Dusty wandered over to investigate the newcomer. Instead of showing the wariness many animals displayed around strangers, the donkey approached with calm curiosity, allowing Father Santos to stroke its neck. "This animal has found peace," the priest observed. "There is healing here, not just in the body, but in the spirit. You have done good work, my friend." "Just gave it food and shelter," Eli said, uncomfortable with praise. "No," Father Santos shook his head. "You gave it dignity. You saw value where others saw only burden. That is a rare gift." He paused, watching Dusty move among Eli's cattle, with easy confidence. "Sometimes God sends us exactly what we need, though it may not look like what we expected." As summer advanced, talk began among the local ranchers about the annual cattle drive to market. It would be Eli's first drive since Sarah's death, and he found himself looking forward to it in a way he hadn't expected. More than that, he was planning to take Dusty along. The decision raised eyebrows among some of his neighbors, but Eli had seen enough of Dusty's abilities to trust the donkey's capabilities. Besides, Ranger was getting older, and the long drive would be hard on the horse. Dusty, despite its smaller size, had proven remarkably hardy and willing. Preparing for the drive meant checking equipment, planning routes, and coordinating with other ranchers. It also meant testing Dusty's endurance and confirming its ability to work with unfamiliar cattle and people. Every test the donkey passed with quiet competence. One afternoon, while Eli was examining his tack and making repairs, a young bull broke through a fence section and began threatening the other cattle. Before Eli could react, Dusty had placed itself between the bull and the herd, standing firm despite being considerably smaller than the agitated animal. The bull, confused by this unexpected challenge from such an unusual opponent, lowered its head and pawed the ground. But instead of backing down, Dusty held its position, radiating a calm authority that somehow diffused the situation. After several tense moments, the bull lost interest and wandered away to graze. "Well, I'll be," Eli said aloud, impressed by the donkey's protective instincts. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" That evening, as Eli groomed Dusty and checked the healing progress of the old brand mark, he reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. What had started as an act of simple mercy had evolved into something he hadn't expected, a true partnership. The donkey had not only recovered its health, but had revealed abilities that made it genuinely valuable to ranch operations. More than that, Dusty had brought something back to Eli's life that he'd thought was lost forever, a sense of companionship and shared purpose. As he worked, Dusty stood patiently, occasionally turning its head to watch Eli's hands or to nuzzle his shoulder affectionately. The simple interaction filled something in Eli that had been empty since Sarah's death. Tomorrow they would begin final preparations for the cattle drive. It would be a test of everything they'd learned about working together, but Eli felt ready for the challenge. Whatever came, he and Dusty would face it as partners. The hand-carved bucket sat in its place by the barn door, catching the evening light on the carefully carved letters of Dusty's name. It was a small thing, but it represented something larger, the transformation of two broken souls into something stronger together than either could be alone. The cattle drive began before dawn, with 300 head of mixed longhorns and crossbred stock moving north toward the railhead at Dodge City. Eli had joined with 4 other ranchers for the drive, combining their herds for safety and efficiency. The other men, Pete Hawkins, Jim Crawford, young Bobby Martinez, and grizzled veteran Frank Cooper, had all expressed varying degrees of skepticism about bringing a donkey on such a demanding journey. "I hope that donkey of yours can keep up," Frank Cooper said, as they positioned themselves around the herd. Frank had been driving cattle for 30 years and had strong opinions about proper equipment. "This ain't a Sunday ride in the park." Eli touched the silver compass in his vest pocket, a habit he'd developed whenever facing uncertainty. The compass had belonged to his father, who'd carried it through his own cattle driving days and passed it to Eli with simple advice. "True north never changes, son. When you're lost, that's the direction that'll see you home." Dusty seemed to understand the importance of the day. The donkey moved with calm confidence among the cattle, positioning itself naturally in the herd structure and responding to Eli's signals with practiced ease. As the sun climbed higher and the drive settled into its rhythm, Eli noticed the other cowboys beginning to pay attention to how Dusty worked. The first real test came at Willow Creek, swollen with spring runoff and running fast enough to make the crossing treacherous. The cattle balked at the water's edge, bunching together and refusing to enter the swift current. This was exactly the kind of situation where an inexperienced animal could cause serious problems, spooking the herd or getting itself in trouble, but Dusty surprised everyone. Without waiting for direction, the donkey waded into the creek, moving confidently through water that came up to its belly. The sight of the small, sure-footed animal crossing calmly had an immediate effect on the cattle. If the donkey could make it safely, they seemed to reason, so could they. "I'll be damned," Jim Crawford said, watching his own cattle follow Dusty's lead into the water. "That little donkey's got more sense than half my horses." By the time the entire herd was safely across, even Frank Cooper was nodding approvingly. "Might be there's more to that animal than meets the eye," he admitted grudgingly. The trail presented constant challenges, rocky terrain that tested every animal's endurance, steep grades that required careful pacing, and always the need to keep 300 independently minded cattle moving in the same direction. Dusty proved invaluable in ways Eli hadn't anticipated. When a group of young steers decided to explore a side canyon instead of staying with the herd, Dusty darted after them with remarkable agility. The donkey's sure-footedness on rough ground allowed it to navigate terrain that would have been treacherous for a horse, cutting off the wandering cattle and turning them back toward the main group. "That donkey moves like a mountain goat," Bobby Martinez observed admiringly. "Never seen anything quite like it." The evenings on the trail revealed another side of Dusty's nature. As the cowboys gathered around the campfire for supper, the donkey would position itself at the edge of the firelight, alert and watchful. Unlike horses, which often dozed standing, Dusty remained clearly awake and attentive throughout the night. "It's like having an extra sentry," Pete Hawkins noted one evening as they sat around the fire drinking coffee and sharing stories. "That donkey's got ears like a rabbit and eyes like a hawk." Frank Cooper, warming to the topic after initial skepticism, added, "Worked with mules that were good night guards, but never seen anything quite like this. It's like the animal understands the job without being taught." As they talked, Dusty moved quietly around the perimeter of their camp, checking on the horses, investigating sounds in the darkness, and generally maintaining a vigilant presence that allowed the men to rest easier. Eli found himself consulting his father's compass less frequently as the days passed, guided instead by his growing trust in Dusty's instincts. The third night out, that trust was put to the ultimate test. Eli was on first watch when Dusty suddenly raised its head, ears pricked forward toward the western darkness. The donkey's body language was tense, but not panicked, the stance of an animal that had detected something requiring attention. "What is it, Dusty?" Eli whispered, reaching for his rifle while following the donkey's gaze. Minutes passed before Eli heard what Dusty had already detected: the distant sound of wolves calling to each other. The pack was still far away, but moving closer, likely. Drawn by the scent of the cattle, Eli woke Frank Cooper, whose experience with predators was extensive. "Wolves," Eli said quietly. "Dusty heard them before I did." Frank listened for a moment, then nodded. "Good ears on that donkey. We'll need to build up the fires and keep extra watch. Wolves don't usually bother a herd this size, but you never know." Throughout the night, Dusty remained alert and mobile, moving from one side of the camp to the other, always positioning itself between any suspicious sounds and the main group. The wolves never came close enough to threaten the cattle, but their howling continued intermittently until dawn. "That donkey probably saved us a stampede," Frank said the next morning, looking at Dusty with new respect. "Cattle get spooked by wolves, and a 300-head stampede in the dark ain't something any of us wants to see." As the drive continued, Eli found himself relying more and more on Dusty's judgment. When the donkey showed reluctance to cross a particular stretch of ground, Eli learned to investigate before proceeding. More than once, this caution revealed hidden dangers: prairie dog holes that could break a horse's leg, soft ground that might bog down cattle, or terrain that was less stable than it appeared. The evenings became a time for deeper connection between man and animal. While the other cowboys tended their horses or played cards, Eli would sit with Dusty, sometimes talking quietly about the day's challenges, sometimes simply sharing comfortable silence under the vast prairie sky. "You know, Dusty," Eli said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the western horizon in shades of gold and purple, "I used to think a man was meant to stand alone, especially after losing someone important. But maybe that's not true. Maybe the strongest thing you can do is let someone else share the load. Dusty turned to look at him with those intelligent brown eyes, and for a moment Eli felt like the donkey truly understood. Not the words, perhaps, but the sentiment behind them. The compass in Eli's pocket caught the firelight as he shifted position. True north never changed, his father had said, but Eli was beginning to understand that finding your way home wasn't just about direction. Sometimes it was about finding the right companion for the journey. The cattle drive had been their greatest success, earning Eli enough to make improvements to his ranch and secure his position through the coming winter. More importantly, it had proven to the entire community that his partnership with Dusty was more than sentimentality. It was practical wisdom. The other ranchers now spoke of the donkey with genuine respect, and several had asked Eli's advice about working with difficult animals. But their return to familiar territory brought news that cast a shadow over their triumph. Sheriff Tom Willis rode out to Eli's ranch 3 days after their homecoming, his face grim with the kind of worry that came with serious trouble. "We got problems, Eli," the sheriff said, accepting the cup of coffee offered but not drinking it. "Word's come down from Dodge City about a gang operating in this territory. They call themselves the Barton Gang, led by a man named Silas Barton. They've hit 3 ranches in the past month, stealing cattle, horses, anything valuable they can move quick." Eli studied the torn wanted poster the sheriff handed him. The paper was weathered from travel and handling, but the faces were clear. Enough. Silas Barton looked like a man who'd never known kindness, with cold eyes and a mouth set in permanent cruelty. The reward offered was substantial. $500 for Barton, $200 each for his known associates. "How many?" "In the gang?" Eli asked, studying the faces on the poster. "At least 6, maybe more. They hit fast and hard, usually at night when families are asleep, take what they want and disappear before anyone can organize pursuit." Sheriff Willis finally took a sip of his coffee, his hands not quite steady. "I'm warning all the ranchers in the valley. They seem to favor isolated spreads, places where they can work without witnesses." As the sheriff spoke, Dusty wandered over from the corral, ears forward with interest. The donkey had developed an uncanny ability to sense when conversations were serious, often positioning itself where it could observe both Eli and any visitors. "That's some animal you got there," Sheriff Willis noted. "Heard in town how it performed on the drive. Might be you'll need that kind of help if these outlaws come calling." After the sheriff left, Eli tacked the wanted poster to the inside of his barn door, where he'd see it daily. The faces stared back at him with the kind of hardness that spoke of lives spent taking from others. But it was more than their appearance that troubled him. It was the timing of their operations and the methodical way they seemed to choose their targets. Over the following weeks, subtle signs of unrest began to appear in the valley. Cattle would be found in unusual groupings, as if someone had been moving them during the night. Strange horse tracks appeared near water sources and fence lines. Most disturbing were the reports from other ranchers of things going missing. Small items at first, tools or tack that might have been misplaced, but then more valuable things that couldn't be explained away. Dusty's behavior began to change in ways that made Eli pay closer attention. The donkey's already keen senses seemed to sharpen further, its head coming up at sounds too distant for human ears, its eyes tracking movement in areas where Eli saw nothing unusual. Where before Dusty had been alert and watchful, now it seemed almost hyper-vigilant. One morning, Eli found Dusty standing at the fence line, staring intently toward the Morrison place. The donkey's body language was tense, ears pricked forward, nostrils flared as if catching scents that carried information. When Eli followed Dusty's gaze, he could see nothing unusual, but the donkey's concern was unmistakable. "What is it, friend?" Eli asked quietly, but Dusty remained focused on whatever had caught its attention. Later that day, Pete Hawkins rode over with news that someone had cut his fence during the night and driven off a dozen head of cattle. The thieves had been professional about it, taking only the best animals and leaving no clear trail to follow. "It's starting," Pete said grimly. "Just like the sheriff warned, they're testing us, seeing what they can get away with." The community meeting that evening filled the small church in town beyond capacity. Ranchers, townspeople, and anyone else. with something to lose, gathered to discuss the growing threat. The conversation was heated but productive, with plans made for increased patrols, better communication between spreads, and mutual assistance agreements. But as Eli listened to the worried voices around him, he found his attention drawn to thoughts of his isolated ranch and his growing dependence on Dusty's remarkable abilities. The donkey had already proven invaluable in legitimate ranch work, but Eli was beginning to suspect those same qualities might be crucial in dealing with more dangerous challenges. Riding home under a star-filled sky, Eli noticed how Dusty's head turned constantly, ears swiveling to catch sounds from multiple directions. The donkey was reading the night in ways that Eli's human senses couldn't match, processing information. That might mean the difference between safety and danger. You know something's coming, don't you? Eli said quietly, leaning forward to pat Dusty's neck. Question is, are we ready for it? The next few days brought more troubling signs. Frank Cooper's horses were spooked one night by something that left them nervous and jumpy for hours afterward. Jim Crawford found evidence that someone had been watching his house from the woods, with bent grass and cigarette butts marking a hidden vantage point. Most unsettling was the change in Jake Morrison's behavior. The normally abrasive man had become almost reclusive, barely acknowledging his neighbors when they met on the road. When Eli tried to warn him about the increased security measures being taken by other ranchers, Jake's response was curt and dismissive. "I can take care of my own problems," Jake had said, but his eyes held a nervousness that didn't match his confident words. One evening, as Eli was finishing his daily chores, Dusty suddenly raised its head and let out a sharp, warning bray. The E sound cut through the evening air like an alarm, urgent and unmistakable. Eli grabbed his rifle and moved quickly toward the fence line where Dusty stood rigid with attention. In the gathering dusk, he could see riders moving along the distant ridge, at least 3 men on horseback silhouetted against the darkening sky. They were too far away to identify, but their position suggested they were observing rather than simply passing through. When the riders realized they'd been spotted, they disappeared quickly into the brush. "Good eyes, Dusty," Eli murmured, keeping his rifle ready as he scanned the darkening landscape. "Good ears, too." That night, Eli slept fitfully, waking periodically to check on Dusty, who remained alert throughout the dark hours. The donkey's vigilance was reassuring, but also ominous. Clear evidence that danger was closer than anyone wanted to admit. The torn wanted poster seemed to stare at him from the barn wall, its weathered edges a reminder that some storms couldn't be avoided, only endured. But as Eli looked at Dusty's steady, intelligent profile in the moonlight, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the comfort of not facing that storm alone. The discovery came by accident, which later made Eli wonder if accidents were ever truly accidental. He'd been following Dusty through the scrub brush along his eastern fence line, trusting the donkey's instincts, as he'd learned to do when they came upon Jake Morrison's hidden camp. It wasn't much. A small clearing concealed by mesquite and prickly pear, with the cold remains of a campfire and evidence that someone had been using the spot regularly. But what caught Eli's attention weren't the obvious signs of occupation. It was the papers scattered by the morning wind, legal documents that had no business being in the middle of nowhere. Dusty had found them first, nosing at a piece of paper caught on a thorny bush. As Eli carefully extracted the document, he recognized it immediately as a deed. Jake Morrison's deed to his ranch, marked with stamps and signatures that told a story Jake had been keeping secret. The papers revealed everything. Jake's ranch was mortgaged to the limit, with payments months overdue, to a bank in Kansas City. But more damning were the letters from private creditors, men with names Eli recognized from wanted posters, men who collected debts with violence rather than legal processes. A letter dated just 2 weeks earlier made Eli's blood run cold. "Morrison, you owe us $12,000, and our patience is finished. You deliver as promised, or we'll take payment in blood. The Turner spread looks profitable. Make sure his cattle are marked proper when we arrive. S. Barton." The pieces fell together with horrible clarity. Jake hadn't just abandoned that donkey. At Eli's gate, he'd been planning something much worse all along. The rustling, the mysterious riders, the careful observation of ranch operations. It had all been preparation for a coordinated theft, with Jake Morrison as the inside man. Dusty stood quietly while Eli read through the documents. But the donkeys' ears were constantly moving, monitoring their surroundings with the vigilance that had become second nature. When footsteps approached through the brush, Dusty's sharp bray of warning gave Eli just enough time to fold the papers and prepare for confrontation. Jake Morrison stepped into the clearing, his face dark with anger and something else. Fear. He was armed, his hand resting on his pistol grip, but his eyes kept darting around as if expecting other threats. "You got no business here, Turner," Jake said, his voice tight with strain. "This is my land." "Is it?" Eli replied calmly, holding up the deed papers. "According to these documents, you don't own much of anything anymore. Question is, what were you planning to do about it?" Jake's face went pale, then flushed with desperate anger. "You don't understand the situation I'm in. Those men, they'll kill me if I don't deliver what I promised. And what exactly did you promise them, Jake?" The silence stretched between them, broken only by Dusty's soft snorting as the donkey tested the air for sense of danger. Finally, Jake's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Your cattle," he admitted. "Your land. They wanted a rich target. Someone who'd have enough stock to make it worth their while. I told them about your successful drive, about how much money you'd made." Eli felt a cold fury building in his chest, not just at the betrayal, but at the casual way Jake had marked him for destruction. "So you've been their scout, watching my ranch, marking my cattle, reporting my routines." "I didn't have a choice." Jake's voice cracked with desperation. "They would have killed me, taken my land anyway. This way, at least I survive." "What about my survival, Jake? What about my life?" Jake's hand moved closer to his gun, but his eyes showed no real conviction. "I'm sorry, Eli, I truly am, but it's you or me, and I choose me." The confrontation might have escalated to violence, but Dusty suddenly stiffened, head turning toward the eastern approach to the clearing. The donkey's warning came just as the sound of multiple horses reached human ears, riders approaching at a careful pace, trying to move quietly, but not quite succeeding. "They're early," Jake whispered, fear replacing anger in his voice. "They weren't supposed to come until tonight." Eli quickly counted the approaching sounds. At least 4 horses, maybe more. Too many to fight in an open confrontation, especially with Jake's uncertain loyalty. But Dusty was already moving, positioning itself between Eli and the most likely approach route, ears laid back in a way Eli had never seen before. "Call them off, Jake," Eli said quietly, his rifle ready, but not yet raised. "This doesn't have to end in blood." "I can't," Jake replied miserably. "They don't listen to me. I'm just the bait they used to set the trap." The first rider emerged from the brush, and Eli immediately recognized Silas Barton from the wanted poster. The outlaw leader was exactly what Eli had expected, cold-eyed, heavily armed, and carrying himself with the casual cruelty of a man who took what he wanted without conscience. "Well, well," Barton said, surveying the scene with satisfaction. "Looks like our friend Morrison delivered exactly what he promised. Turner, you're going to make this very easy for us." 2 more riders appeared, flanking Barton with practiced efficiency. All were armed with rifles and pistols, clearly experienced in violence, but what troubled Eli most was their confidence. They acted like men who had never failed in their criminal enterprises. "Your cattle are already marked," Barton continued conversationally. "Morrison's been busy these past weeks, making sure we know exactly which animals belong to you. We'll be taking them tonight, along with your horses and anything else of value. The question is whether you'll be alive to see us leave." Dusty's soft growl was so unexpected that even Barton's horse shied slightly. The donkey had never made such a sound before, but there was no mistaking the protective threat in it. Despite being vastly outgunned and outnumbered, Dusty was preparing to fight. "That's an interesting animal you got there," Barton observed with amusement. "Might be worth something broken to saddle. We'll add it to our take." The casual mention of breaking Dusty triggered something in Eli that years of careful self-control couldn't contain. This wasn't just about theft anymore. It was about everything that mattered to him, everything he'd built and protected and learned to love again. "The donkey's not for sale," Eli said quietly, but his voice carried a finality that made even Barton pay closer attention. "Everything's for sale, Turner. Question is whether the price gets paid in money or blood." Jake Morrison stood frozen between the two forces, his face showing the realization that he'd made a bargain with devils who had no intention of keeping their word. The papers in Eli's pocket felt heavy with the weight of betrayal, but they also represented something else, evidence of Jake's desperation and the organized nature of the threat. As the standoff continued, with more riders still approaching through the brush, Eli found himself thinking not about the odds against them, but about the journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a lonely widower, going through the motions of living. The act of saving one abandoned donkey had changed everything, giving him purpose, companionship, and now something worth fighting for. Dusty stood beside him like a small, determined guardian, ready to face impossible odds rather than abandon his partner. The sight filled Eli with a fierce pride and a calm certainty about what came next. "Jake," Eli said without taking his eyes off Barton, "you still got a choice. It's not too late to do the right thing." But Jake Morrison's face showed only the hollow despair of a man who'd already made his decision and couldn't find the courage to change it. The papers rustled in Eli's pocket as the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of approaching storm, both meteorological and human. The confrontation in the clearing ended not with gunfire, but with Barton's calculated retreat. "Tonight, Turner," the outlaw leader had said with cold certainty, "when the moon sets and the darkness is complete, we'll come for everything you have. Use the time to make your peace." Now, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his ranch, Eli moved with the methodical precision of a man who understood that survival depended on preparation. He'd sent Jake Morrison away with a warning: leave the territory or face the consequences when this was over. Jake's cowardice had been complete, fleeing toward town with the frantic haste of a man who knew he'd chosen the wrong side. Dusty followed Eli from building to building as they assessed defenses and identified advantages. The ranch layout, which had always seemed humble and practical, now revealed itself as potentially strategic. The house sat on a slight rise, giving clear sightlines in all directions. The barn was positioned to provide cover while protecting the animals. The corral fence, built strong enough to contain cattle, might also serve to channel attackers into predictable approaches. "What do you think, partner?" Eli asked, studying the ground between the house and the creek. "They'll come from the east, using the creek bed for cover, but that means they'll have to cross open ground to reach the buildings." Dusty's ears swiveled as the donkey analyzed the same terrain, and Eli had learned to trust his companion's instincts about such things. Where Eli saw tactical advantages, Dusty seemed to sense the emotional currents, the places where fear and determination would clash, where courage would be tested against overwhelming odds. Inside the house, Eli retrieved items he'd hoped never to need for defense. His father's old Sharps rifle, cleaned and loaded, with enough ammunition for a prolonged fight. Sarah's Colt revolver, which she'd learned to use during their early years, when the frontier was even wilder than it was now. And from a secret compartment, behind the kitchen cabinet, wrapped carefully in soft cloth, Sarah's wedding ring. The ring caught the afternoon light as Eli held it in his palm, remembering the day he'd placed it on her finger and the promises they'd made to each other. Simple gold, worn smooth by years of work and devotion, it represented everything he'd lost and everything he'd slowly learned to value again. "I should have given this to you properly," he said quietly, thinking of the grave on the hill where wildflowers still grew despite his neglect. "Should have told you how sorry I was that our time was cut short." But as he held the ring, Eli realized something had changed in his relationship with grief. The ache was still there, the sense of loss that would never fully heal, but it no longer dominated every thought. Dusty's presence had taught him that love didn't end with death. It transformed, becoming something that could be shared with new companions without diminishing what had come before. He tucked the ring into his shirt pocket, close to his heart, where it would remind him what he was fighting for. The sound of approaching horses made both man and donkey freeze with attention, but these riders announced themselves with calls of greeting rather than stealth. Pete Hawkins led the group, 5 men in total, all armed and determined-looking. "Heard in town that you might be having visitors tonight," Pete said, dismounting with the careful movements of a man past his prime, but not past usefulness. "Figured you could use some help." Frank Cooper was there, along with Jim Crawford and young Bobby Martinez. The 5th man surprised Eli. It was Father Miguel Santos, the traveling preacher, carrying an old but well-maintained rifle with the familiarity of someone who'd used it before. "The Lord helps those who help themselves," Father Santos explained with a gentle smile, "and sometimes he sends friends to share the burden." As the men examined the ranch's defensive possibilities, Eli felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fading sunlight. These men had families and responsibilities of their own, but they'd chosen to risk themselves for a neighbor in need. The frontier could be harsh and unforgiving, but it also bred a kind of loyalty that city folks might never understand. "They'll come in force," Frank said, studying the approaches with experienced eyes. "Probably 6 or 8 men, all armed and used to taking what they want. But they're not used to organized resistance. Most of their targets have been isolated families or single ranchers." Pete nodded agreement. "We position ourselves right, make them fight for every yard, and they might decide it's not worth the cost. Or they might decide to burn us out," Jim added grimly. "These aren't the kind of men who walk away from a fight once it's started." As they planned positions and fields of fire, Dusty moved among the men with calm interest, seeming to understand that these humans were allies in whatever was coming. The donkey's presence had a subtle effect on the group, reminding them that they were protecting more than just property. They were defending a way of life that valued kindness over cruelty, cooperation over exploitation. Father Santos took particular interest in Dusty, scratching behind the donkey's ears while speaking quietly in Spanish. "This animal has a peaceful spirit," he told Eli. "But I sense great courage, too. It will not abandon you when the test comes." As evening approached, the men took their positions. Pete and Frank would cover the eastern approaches from the barn. Jim and Bobby would position themselves near the corral, with good sightlines to the north and south. Father Santos, despite his religious calling, proved to have extensive military experience and took the position with the best overall view of the ranch. Eli and Dusty would remain mobile, responding to threats as they developed and coordinating. The defense. It wasn't perfect, but it gave them a fighting chance against superior numbers. The last preparations were made in gathering darkness. Lanterns were extinguished, weapons checked one final time, and positions confirmed. But as the moon began its arc across the star-filled sky, Eli found himself standing in the corral with Dusty, sharing a moment of quiet before the storm. "You know what's coming, don't you?" Eli said, running his hands over Dusty's neck and shoulders, feeling the strength that had developed during their months together. "Nobody would blame you if you wanted to be somewhere else when it starts." Dusty's response was to step closer, pressing against Eli's side with the solid warmth of absolute loyalty. Whatever came, they would face it together. "I need you to understand something," Eli continued, his voice thick with emotion. "When Jake Morrison dumped you at my gate, I thought I was saving your life, but it turns out you were saving mine. You gave me a reason to care about tomorrow again, to believe that good things were still possible." The donkey's dark eyes reflected starlight as it watched Eli's face, and once again the man felt that uncanny sense of being truly understood by his 4-legged companion. "If we don't make it through tonight," Eli said, placing both hands on Dusty's face, "I want you to know that these months have been the best I've had since Sarah died. You brought something back to life in me that I thought was gone forever." A soft sound from the eastern darkness made both man and donkey turn their attention toward the approaching threat. It was beginning. Pete's voice came soft but clear across the ranch yard. "Riders coming. At least 6, maybe more. They're trying to move quiet, but they're not as good at it as they think. Eli checked his weapons one final time, making sure everything was ready. The Sharps rifle was loaded and additional. Ammunition was within easy reach. Sarah's Colt sat comfortable in its holster, cleaned and loaded, as she'd taught him years ago. Most importantly, his father's silver compass was secure in his pocket, ready to guide him through whatever darkness lay ahead. "You ready, Dusty?" he whispered to his companion. The donkey's soft snort and forward-pricked ears were answer enough. Whatever Silas Barton and his gang had planned, they were about to discover that some things were worth fighting for, and some partnerships were stronger than fear. The wedding ring pressed against Eli's chest with each heartbeat, a reminder of love that endured beyond death and transformed into new forms of devotion. Tonight would test everything he'd learned about loyalty, courage, and the bonds that could form between the most unlikely partners. In the distance, the sound of horses moving through brush grew closer. The final test was about to begin. They came not in the deepest darkness as expected, but in the grey hour before dawn, when shadows played tricks on tired eyes and the mind struggled between sleep and wakefulness. Barton was cleverer than Eli had anticipated, choosing the time when defenders would be least alert, most vulnerable to the confusion that could turn a battle. But Dusty was ready. The modified bell collar around the donkey's neck, a device Eli had crafted during their long evenings together, gave the softest chime as Dusty raised its head toward the eastern approach. Not loud enough to alert the attackers, but clear enough to wake Eli from his doze against the corral post. The collar had been born from necessity and understanding. Eli had noticed how Dusty's exceptional hearing often detected threats long before human senses could register them. But the donkey's natural warnings, braying or snorting, might also alert approaching danger to their awareness. The tiny bells, sewn into a soft leather collar and muffled with cloth, created a communication system that was both subtle and effective. Now, as the first pale light touched the eastern horizon, that system proved its worth. Dusty's slight head movement caused the faintest musical whisper, enough to bring Eli fully alert without betraying their readiness to whoever was approaching through the pre-dawn gloom. Eli touched Dusty's neck gently, acknowledging the warning, then moved into position behind the water trough where he had clear sightlines while remaining concealed. The donkey followed, positioning itself where it could observe multiple approaches while staying close enough to Eli to maintain their communication. The first rider appeared at the edge of rifle range, a dark silhouette against the lighter sky. Silas Barton sat his horse with the casual confidence of a man who'd never met serious resistance, studying the ranch buildings with the calculating eye of a predator assessing prey. "Turner," Barton's voice carried clearly across the still morning. I know you're awake in there. Might as well come out and make this easy on everyone." Eli remained silent, using the time to count riders as they emerged from concealment. 7 men, all armed, positioned to cover the main approaches to his buildings, but their positioning also revealed something important. They expected to face a single frightened rancher, not an organized defense. "We know you got help in there," Barton continued, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "Old men and a preacher from what we heard in town. They're going to get hurt if this goes hard, Turner. You want that on your conscience?" The psychological warfare was beginning, the attempt to isolate Eli emotionally and make him feel responsible for whatever happened to his friends. But Dusty's steady presence beside him, the warm reality of their partnership, helped Eli maintain his focus on what mattered. Pete Hawkins' voice came from the barn, calm and steady. "Barton, you're trespassing on private property. Turn around and ride out, and nobody has to get hurt." Barton's laughter was genuinely amused. "Old man, you got no idea what you're interfering with. This is business, and Turner owes a debt that's gonna get paid one way or another. The only debt around here is the one Jake Morrison owes for his betrayal," Eli called out, finally speaking, "and you're going to find collecting it harder than you expect." The first shot came without warning, aimed, not at the defenders, but at the water trough near Eli's position. The bullet sparked off the metal rim, sending a clear message. They knew where he was and could have killed him if that had been their immediate intent. But Dusty's reaction to the gunshot surprised everyone, including Eli. Instead of bolting or cowering, the donkey moved with swift intelligence toward the barn, using the building's wall for cover while positioning itself where it could observe the attackers' movements. The donkey was thinking tactically, reading the battlefield with an instinct that seemed almost supernatural. "That's some animal you got there, Turner," Barton called out, having observed Dusty's maneuver. "Shame it's gonna die with the rest of you." The second phase of the attack began with coordinated movement. 3 riders started a flanking maneuver around the south side of the ranch, while 2 others dismounted and began working their way forward on foot, using fence posts and scattered equipment for cover. But Dusty was tracking all of their movements, the bell collar giving soft warnings that allowed Eli to relay positions to his friends without exposing himself or shouting over the distances involved. A gentle touch to the collar, and Eli could indicate direction and urgency to the donkey, who would then position itself to give the clearest view of developing threats. Frank Cooper's rifle spoke from the barn, dropping one of the flanking riders from his saddle. The man didn't get up, and his horse bolted toward the creek with empty stirrups flapping. "That's for thinking we're easy targets," Frank called out. Grimly, the return fire was immediate and concentrated, bullets splintering wood and raising dust around the barn. But the attackers were firing blind, wasting ammunition on targets they couldn't clearly see, while the defenders had carefully prepared positions and clear fields of fire. Dusty's next warning came as the donkey moved to the corner of the corral, ears focused toward the western approach. The bell collar chimed softly, indicating movement where none of the defenders had expected it. 2 more riders were trying to circle around completely, planning to attack from behind. Eli whistled softly, a signal he and Father Santos had arranged, and saw the preacher shift his position to cover the new threat. The coordination was working, the defense holding, but Eli knew this was just the beginning. Barton was testing their resolve and capabilities, probing for weaknesses while keeping his best men in reserve. The real assault would come when he thought he understood what he was facing. What Barton didn't understand was that he wasn't just fighting 6 men and their weapons. He was fighting a partnership that had been forged through months of trust, communication, and mutual dependence. Dusty wasn't just an animal seeking shelter. It was an intelligent ally who understood the stakes and was willing to face them. As gunfire erupted in earnest and the morning light grew stronger, man and donkey moved together with practiced precision, each anticipating the other's needs and responding accordingly. The modified bell collar sang its soft warnings, guiding them through the chaos toward whatever resolution lay ahead. The battle's turning point came when Jake Morrison returned. Eli saw him first, a lone rider approaching from the north, silhouetted against the rising sun. For a moment, hope flickered that Jake had found his courage and come to help his neighbors against the criminals he'd helped create. But the way he rode, hunched and desperate, suggested something different entirely. Dusty's bell collar chimed. Urgent warning as the donkey detected what Eli's eyes couldn't yet see. Jake wasn't alone. He was being driven toward the ranch by 2 more of Barton's men, positioned to cut off any escape route. The trap was closing from multiple directions simultaneously. "Turner!" Jake's voice cracked with desperation as he entered rifle range. "I tried to leave like you said, but they caught me on the road. They're gonna kill me if you don't surrender." Barton's voice followed, filled with cruel satisfaction. "That's right, Turner. Your neighbor's life is in your hands now. Come out with your hands up, and maybe we'll make this quick for everyone." From his position behind the water trough, Eli could see Jake's face clearly now. The man was terrified. But there was something else in his expression, a calculating look that suggested this might be another layer of deception. Jake Morrison had proven himself untrustworthy once already. Dusty seemed to sense Eli's uncertainty about Jake's true intentions. The donkey moved restlessly, ears swiveling between Jake's position and the other attackers, as if trying to process multiple sources of danger simultaneously. The sound of splintering wood came from the barn as Barton's men intensified their assault on the defenders' positions. Pete Hawkins called out that he was running low on ammunition, and Jim Crawford's rifle had fallen silent after taking a bullet crease across his shoulder. It was then that Jake Morrison made his final choice. Instead of dismounting and seeking cover as a genuine captive might, Jake suddenly spurred his horse directly toward Eli's position, drawing his pistol as he rode. The deception was complete. He wasn't a prisoner, but a willing participant, using the ruse to get close enough for a killing shot. But Jake had forgotten about Dusty. The donkey reacted with explosive speed, placing itself directly between Jake's, charging horse and Eli's position. The collision was tremendous. Jake's horse reared and stumbled as it struck the much smaller animal, throwing its rider from the saddle and sending him tumbling across the hard-packed earth. Dusty rolled with the impact, regaining its feet with remarkable agility despite the violent collision. Jake Morrison lay motionless where he'd fallen, his neck bent at an unnatural angle. The betrayal was over. "Dusty!" Eli called out, but the donkey was already moving, positioning itself for the next threat, despite the obvious pain from its collision. With the horse, Barton's rage at seeing his inside man eliminated was immediate and vicious. "Kill them all!" he shouted to his remaining men. "No prisoners, no mercy!" The final assault came with desperate fury. The surviving outlaws abandoned careful tactics for a frontal charge, hoping to overwhelm the defenders through sheer violence. But their anger made them careless, and careful preparation began to tell. Frank Cooper's rifle brought down another rider as he tried to reach the barn. Father Santos, proving his military experience wasn't just legend, placed precise shots that forced the attackers to seek cover rather than maintain their charge. But it was Dusty who turned the tide decisively, as Silas Barton himself spurred his horse toward Eli's position, confident that his superior firepower and position would carry the day. The donkey did something completely unexpected. Instead of seeking safety, Dusty charged directly toward Barton's horse, braying with a sound that was part war cry and part territorial challenge. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Barton's horse, already nervous from gunfire and the smell of blood, panicked completely when confronted by this small, determined adversary. The horse reared, threw its rider, and bolted toward the creek in blind terror. Barton hit the ground hard, but rolled to his feet, drawing both pistols and looking for targets. But he was now on foot, alone, and surrounded by entrenched defenders who had clear shots at his position. "It's over, Barton," Eli called out, his Sharps rifle centered on the outlaw leader's chest. "Your men are dead or running. Drop your weapons." For a moment, Barton's cold eyes showed the calculation of a man weighing his chances of fighting free. But as he looked around at the faces of the men he'd tried to rob and terrorize, he saw something that made his decision for him. These weren't frightened victims anymore. They were neighbors who had stood together against a common threat and discovered their own strength in the process. The broken spurs from one of the fallen outlaws caught the morning sunlight as Barton slowly placed his weapons on the ground. The ornate silver was scratched and dented, symbols of a life spent taking from others, now reduced to worthless metal in the dust. "You win this round, Turner," Barton said, but his voice held no trace of surrender, only the promise of future violence. "But you can't watch your back forever." "Maybe not," Eli replied, keeping his rifle steady, "but I won't be watching it alone." As Sheriff Willis and his deputies arrived to collect the survivors and begin the long process of justice, Eli knelt beside Dusty to examine the donkey's injuries from the collision with Jake's horse. Nothing appeared to be broken, but there would be soreness and bruising that would take time to heal. "You saved my life," Eli said quietly, running gentle hands over Dusty's neck and shoulders. Again, Dusty's response was to lean against Eli's side, sharing warmth and comfort after the violence of the morning. The bell collar chimed softly with the movement, its gentle music a reminder of the communication and trust that had carried them through their darkest hour. The sun was fully risen now, painting the ranch in warm colors that seemed to promise better days ahead. The immediate danger was over, But Eli knew the real victory wasn't in defeating Silas Barton's gang. It was in discovering that kindness, when backed by courage and supported by friendship, could indeed overcome the worst that life had to offer. Titty, broken spurs in the dust would rust and be forgotten, but the bond between man and donkey had been tested in fire and proven unbreakable. 3 months after the morning that changed everything, Eli Turner stood on his front porch with his coffee cup, watching Dusty move among the cattle with the easy confidence of an animal that had found its true calling. The donkey's injuries from the confrontation had healed completely, leaving only the faintest scars to mark the day they'd faced down Silas Barton's gang together. The community's response to their victory had been overwhelming. Neighbors who'd once questioned Eli's wisdom in keeping a worthless donkey now spoke of Dusty with genuine admiration. The story had spread beyond their valley, becoming one of those frontier legends that would be told around campfires for generations. The tale of a man and his donkey who proved that courage came in all sizes. But for Eli, the real transformation wasn't in how others saw them. It was in how he saw himself. The lonely widower who'd gone through the motions of living had become a man with genuine purpose again, not just in the daily work of ranching, but in the deeper satisfaction that came from partnership, from knowing that his life mattered to another living being who depended on him completely. This morning, like every morning for the past year, Dusty had been waiting by the barn when Eli emerged from the house. The donkey's routine never varied. A soft greeting, a gentle nudge for attention, and then the shared walk to begin their daily tasks. But now there was something new above. The barn door that caught the early sunlight, a brass nameplate, professionally engraved with simple words that carried profound meaning. Dusty, partner Eli, had commissioned the plate from the blacksmith in town, wanting something permanent to mark Dusty's place on the ranch, not as livestock or property, but as family. The brass gleamed in the morning light, a visible symbol of the bond that had sustained them through their darkest hour. The sound of an approaching wagon made both man and donkey look toward the main road. Eli recognized the family immediately, the Hendersons, newcomers to the territory who'd bought land on the other side of the valley. Tom Henderson was an earnest young man with a pregnant wife and 2 small children, trying to build a life in country that could be unforgiving to the inexperienced. "Mr. Turner," Tom called out as he brought his wagon to a stop. "Hope we're not intruding. We wanted to thank you again for the help with our well, and Mary has something for you." Mary Henderson, despite being heavy with child, climbed down from the wagon with careful dignity and approached Dusty with obvious delight. "This is the famous donkey we've heard so much about," she said, offering Dusty a carrot from her apron pocket. "The children have been asking to meet him for weeks." As the Henderson children clustered around Dusty with squeals of joy, Eli found himself remembering another conversation from weeks past. Tom Henderson had come to him for advice about dealing with a sick calf, admitting that he'd been inspired by the story of how Eli had saved Dusty to take in the animal rather than putting it down. "Figured if kindness worked for you, might work for us too," Tom had said. The calf had recovered and was now thriving, teaching the Henderson family the same lesson Eli had learned. That compassion, even when it seemed impractical, often proved to be the most practical choice of all. "We brought you something," Mary said, producing a small wooden sign painted with careful letters. "Henderson Ranch, where every creature matters." She smiled shyly. "Tom made it, but the saying comes from our children. They said that's what they learned from your story about Dusty." The gift touched Eli more deeply than he'd expected. To know that his simple act of mercy had influenced an entire family to approach their animals with greater kindness felt like a legacy he could be proud of. As the Hendersons prepared to leave, their youngest daughter, a serious 4-year-old, named Emma, approached Eli with the directness that only children possessed. "Mr. Turner," she said, "Daddy says you were sad before Dusty came, but now you're happy. Is that true?" Eli knelt down to meet her eyes, considering the question with the gravity it deserved. "Yes, Emma, that's true. Sometimes when we lose someone we love very much, it takes a long time to feel happy again. But Dusty helped me remember that love doesn't end. It just finds new ways to grow. After the family left, Eli and Dusty resumed their morning routine, but the conversation with little Emma had stirred memories that demanded attention. He walked to the oak tree on the hill where Sarah rested, Dusty following with the patient understanding that had become natural between them. The wildflowers Sarah had loved were blooming again, tended now not from duty, but from genuine care. Eli knelt beside the simple headstone, brushing away leaves and straightening the fresh bouquet he'd placed there the day before. "I brought someone I wanted you to meet," he said quietly, his hand resting on Dusty's neck. "This is Dusty. I think you would have loved each other." The donkey stood quietly as Eli spoke, seeming to understand the solemnity of the moment. When Eli finished sharing the story of their partnership, Dusty moved closer to the headstone, lowering its head as if paying respects to the woman whose love had shaped the man they now shared their life with. As they walked back down the hill toward the ranch buildings, Eli felt the weight of Sarah's wedding ring in his pocket, not the crushing weight of unresolved grief, but the gentle warmth of love transformed. He'd been carrying it since the night of the confrontation, and now he knew what to do with it. That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Eli took out the ring and examined its simple golden circle in the fading light. Then, with careful deliberation, he threaded it onto Dusty's collar beside the small brass nameplate he'd added there. "There," he said quietly. "Now you're carrying a piece of everyone who matters to this ranch." Dusty turned to look at him with those intelligent brown eyes that had first captured his attention more than a year ago, when a dying donkey had been abandoned at his gate by a man who saw no value in broken things. The transformation was complete. Where there had once been a lonely widower going through the motions of living, there was now a man who understood that healing came through connection, that strength multiplied when shared, and that the most profound partnerships often began with simple acts of mercy. The brass nameplate above the barn door caught the last rays of sunlight, its engraved words glowing like a promise. Dusty, partner, not just in work, but in life. Not just for now, but forever. As darkness fell over the Turner Ranch, man and donkey sat together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the peace that comes from knowing exactly where you belong and who you belong with. Sometimes the most meaningful friendships came from the most unexpected places, and sometimes saving someone else's life was the best way to save your own. The frontier was still harsh, still unforgiving, but it no longer seemed empty. Not when you had a true partner to share both the burdens and the joys of whatever tomorrow might bring.